This isn't the retirement I pictured. I had 32 years with Ontario Hydro. 32 years of early mornings, and steel-toed boots, and driving out to substations in weather that would make a younger man think twice. I retired at 63 with a decent pension, a handshake from my supervisor Ted, and a plan. My wife and I were going to fix up the lake house. Nothing fancy. Just the little A-frame we'd bought in the 90s up near Bancroft. The one with the warped back deck and the wood stove that smoked if you didn't open the flue all the way. We were going to spend our summers there and our winters down in the Niagara region close to our daughter and son-in-law. That was the plan. My wife passed in the spring of 2019. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I wasn't prepared for that. Nobody is, I suppose. But I want you to understand. She was the one who held the architecture of our life together. She knew where things were. She knew which neighbors to wave to and which ones to let be. She knew how to make the wood stove behave. When she was gone, the lake house stopped feeling like a project and started feeling like a place where her absence was louder than anything else. So I sold it. I sold the A-frame and most of what was inside it, and I moved into a smaller place in Simcoe County, a bungalow on a good quiet street, 2 bedrooms, a garage I could actually use. My daughter helped me move in. She brought her husband and they carried boxes, and she cried a little when we found a tin of her mother's buttons in a kitchen drawer. That was a hard day. But we got through it. I want you to know all of this before I tell you the rest, because I need you to understand I am not a man who asks for things easily. I came from a generation that didn't. You sorted your own problems. You didn't show up on somebody's doorstep and announce that you needed help. I am 67 years old, and I have spent most of my life believing that self-sufficiency was next to godliness. Which is why what happened last February was so hard. Not just the situation itself, but having to ask. The furnace went first. It was a Tuesday night, the kind of cold we get up here in February, where the temperature drops to -28 with wind chill, and the weatherman says it like it's a mild inconvenience. I noticed the house felt strange around supper time. Not cold exactly, just not warm either. I checked the thermostat. It read 61. I went down to the basement. The furnace wasn't running. I pressed the reset, waited, pressed it again. Nothing. I called an HVAC company. The man on the phone was polite and told me they could have someone out the next morning. I said, "What about tonight? It's going to be -28. He said they had an emergency line, but there was a 4-hour wait, and the after-hours rate was significant. I told him to put me on the list. The technician showed up at 11:30 at night. He was a young fellow, tired, and he was honest with me. He said the heat exchanger was cracked, and the unit was old enough that parts were difficult to source. He said even if he could get them, I was looking at a repair bill that might exceed the value of the furnace, and he recommended I look at replacement. He showed me the crack on his phone camera. It was real. He wasn't trying to upsell me. I thanked him and I paid the call-out fee, and after he left I sat in my kitchen with 3 sweaters on and I did the math. A new furnace, installed up to code with the permits the township required, was going to run somewhere between $5,000 and $8,000. I had the money. That wasn't the issue. The issue was the wait time. The company he recommended was booked 3 weeks out for installs. 3 weeks. In February. I could get space heaters, I knew that. But my bungalow is a raised ranch, and the layout is such that the bedrooms are at the back, and the living area is at the front, and you cannot adequately heat that floor plan with portable electric units without running up a hydro bill that would make your eyes water, and more importantly, without creating a fire hazard if you ran them overnight. I'd spent 32 years working with electricity. I knew what those things could do. I called my daughter. I want to be precise here. I did not call her in a panic. I did not dramatize the situation. I said, "There's a problem with the furnace. It needs to be replaced. It's going to take a few weeks, and I'm wondering if it might be possible to stay in your spare room in the meantime." Very calm. Very straightforward. She said she'd have to talk to her husband. I said, "Of course, take your time." She said she'd call me back. She didn't call back that night. I slept in the kitchen with the oven door open a crack. I know, and 2 blankets and all 3 sweaters, and I woke up at 3 in the morning because I could see my own breath. My son-in-law's name is not important. What's important is who he is. He is 39 years old. He works in commercial real estate. He has opinions about wine and about the correct way to load a dishwasher, and he has, from the very first time my daughter brought him home for dinner, treated me with a particular brand of polite condescension. that I have no word for except to say it was the kind of politeness that made you feel smaller for receiving it. He never said anything outright rude. He was always technically courteous, but there was always something underneath it, some implication that my presence required tolerance rather than welcome. My daughter called back the next morning. It was just after 8. I was still in the kitchen. The house was 54 degrees. She said they'd talked about it, and there were a few concerns. Her husband worked from home now. He'd been doing that since the pandemic, and he needed the environment to be a certain way for his productivity. The spare room was adjacent to his home office. She said he found noise disruptive. She said they'd also just had the guest room redecorated. She was saying all of this carefully, the way you say something when you've been instructed on how to say it. I asked her what she was telling me. She said she was sorry, Dad, but it wasn't a good time. I remember standing there in my kitchen in 3 sweaters in a 54-degree house and looking out the window snow and thinking, this is my daughter. I remember thinking that very clearly. Not my son-in-law, my daughter. I said, okay. I said, I understood. I said, thank you for calling. And then I hung up and I stood there for another minute, and then I started making other calls. My neighbor Cliff, 64, retired from the OPP, good man. He said immediately that I was welcome to his couch for as long as I needed. His wife Barb seconded it before he'd even finished the sentence. I said no, I couldn't impose like that, I'd figure something out. Cliff said, Norm, it's February, stop being stubborn. I said I'd think about it. I booked myself into a motel on the highway, the kind of place that rents by the week, clean enough, nothing special. $49 a night plus tax. I packed a bag, arranged to have my mail held, called the furnace company to get on the schedule, and I drove myself out there on a Wednesday morning. I want to tell you about those 3 weeks in that motel, because I think people imagine it was some kind of hardship adventure. It wasn't. It was just quiet in the way that's not restful. The television was always on in the room next to mine. The coffee in the lobby was the kind that's been sitting since 6 in the morning. I ate a lot of Tim Hortons. I read 3 library books. I called my friend Doug in Peterborough more than I usually would have, just to have someone to talk to. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that every single day I was in that motel, I knew my daughter was 20 minutes away in a 4-bedroom house with a finished basement and a guest room that had just been redecorated. I thought about that a lot. I also thought about her mother. My wife would have said something to me. She would have said, don't be too hard on her. She's in a difficult position. He's not easy to live with. And she'd have been right. She was usually right. But she'd also have been on the phone to our daughter herself, and the conversation she'd have had would have been very different from the one I had. She had a way of saying things plainly that somehow still left the other person feeling cared for. I never learned that trick. I always came out sounding either too soft or too blunt. The furnace was installed on the 22nd of February. The installer was a woman named Jenny, mid-40s, ran her own crew, worked clean and fast, and had the job done by 3 in the afternoon. I shook her hand and paid the invoice and drove back from the motel that evening and walked into a house that was 68 degrees and smelled like fresh ductwork. I stood in the kitchen and I thought, now what? I didn't call my daughter for 2 weeks after I got home. She called me first. She said she'd been thinking about me. She hoped everything had worked out okay. Was the furnace fixed? I said yes. She said, good, that's a relief. There was a pause. I let it sit there. She said she was sorry that the timing hadn't worked out. I said the timing. She said with everything going on. I asked her what was going on. She said, and I remember this very clearly, she said it had just been a busy period. I said, I spent 3 weeks in a motel in February. I said it quietly. I wasn't shouting. I said it was -28 and your house was 54 degrees, and I spent 3 weeks in a motel because it wasn't a good time. She went quiet. I said, I'm not angry with you. I said it and I meant it. I wasn't angry, not exactly. What I was feeling didn't have a clean name. It was something closer to grief. The kind of grief where you realize something about a person you love and you know you can't unknow it. She started to cry. She said his name, her husband's, and then she stopped herself. I said, I know. She said, Dad, I'm sorry. I said, I know you are. Here is what I did. I did not cause a scene. I did not write anyone a letter. I did not post anything on the internet or call my son-in-law on the phone and tell him what I thought of him. What I did was simpler and I think more permanent. I called my lawyer. I had a will, most people my age do, and I had always assumed its contents in a general way. My daughter was my only child. things would go to her. That's how I'd always thought of it. The bungalow, the savings, what was left of the pension payout, the small investment account I'd been adding to quietly since I was 42. It wasn't a fortune, but it wasn't nothing either. I sat down with my lawyer on a Thursday afternoon, and I told him I wanted to make some changes. He is a careful man, my lawyer. Patrick knows me well enough to ask the right questions without overstepping. He asked if I was sure. I said yes. He asked if this was coming from emotion or from consideration. I said I've been considering it for 2 weeks in a motel in February. He nodded and we got to work. I set up a charitable remainder trust. It's a thing you can do in Canada. You put assets into the trust, you receive income from it while you're alive, and when you die, the remainder goes to the charities you've named rather than to your estate. I named 3, the United Way, the local hospice that took care of my wife at the end, and the animal shelter where we got our old dog Henry, who died in 2017 and who was the best dog I ever had. I didn't disinherit my daughter. I want to be clear about that. She will still receive the bungalow and what's in my checking account and a small portion of the savings. But the investment account, the one I'd quietly been tending for 25 years, that's going elsewhere. Her husband will never see cent of it. Whether she tells him or not is up to her. I also updated my power of attorney. I removed my son-in-law as secondary. I named Cliff instead. He said he was honored. Barb made me a pot of soup when I told them. I see my daughter on the first Sunday of every month now. We meet for lunch, usually a place in town we both like, a family restaurant with good chowder and the kind of service where they refill your coffee without being asked. We talk about ordinary things. She asks about my garden in summer. I ask about her work. She's a physiotherapist, good at her job, always was. We don't talk about her husband much. She doesn't bring him up and neither do I. I don't know what goes on inside her marriage. I stopped trying to understand it a long time ago. What I know is that on a Tuesday night in February, when the temperature was -28 and my house was 54 degrees, I called my daughter and she talked to her husband, and they decided it wasn't a good time. That's the kind of thing that doesn't go away. You can forgive it. I have, mostly. But it changes the shape of things. It's like a hairline crack in something structural. The thing still stands. It's just not what it was. I am 67 years old. I have a good furnace now. I have a neighbor named Cliff who told me to stop being stubborn, and a lawyer named Patrick who asked me the right questions, and a hospice that looked after my wife with more tenderness than I can describe, and a memory of a dog named Henry who used to sleep across my feet in winter. Last October, I planted 6 new cedar trees along the back fence. That's the thing about planting trees when you're my age. People think it's optimistic. It's not. It's just something to do with your hands while you figure out what kind of man you're going to be for whatever time you have left. I think I know the answer. I've known since February.